Hello there. It's great to see you. I'm Lauren Borchard, Director of Historical Programs at the U.S. Capitol Historical Society. Today, we welcome you back for another edition of Lunch Bites with Steve and Jane. Today, Steve will be speaking about some of the blocks near First Street and Independence Avenue Southeast. And he told us just before the program started that he's found so much about these that we may revisit this area in the future. So I won't say anything else to spoil it, but I think we have a lot to look forward to today. I'll turn it over now to Jane Campbell, the President and CEO of the U.S. Capitol Historical Society.
Thank you so much, Lauren. Appreciate all the work you do to make these webinars possible. Here we are on our 7th tour of the Capitol Hill neighborhood as we look at the stories about the neighborhood, the buildings, what was there once, what's there now, and how we have built this community that is so precious to all of us. We want to thank each and every one of you for participating today. We want to remind you that these are available only because of the generous support of our members and donors. Thank you very much if you are a member or a donor. And thank you for those of you who share this information with your friends and neighbors. We have found during the time that we are all working from home that we have been able to build an audience that is not just Washington, D.C. based. And after all, the Capitol belongs to all of us in the United States, not just to those who are here in Washington, D.C. Now, the featured event. Steve Livengood, and many of you have heard me introduce him, and many of you probably know him for a much longer time than I, because I've only been at the Historical Society for just over a year. But Steve has been providing tours of the Capitol and the Capitol Hill neighborhoods for over 50 years. He knows every inch of this property, but it doesn't matter. Every time he does a webinar like this, he does a whole new set of research and brings new information. And so today we are going to talk about First and Independence Southeast. If you look today, you see the massive structure of the Library of Congress, but that wasn't always there. So Steve, tell us what used to be there and how did we come to have the Library of Congress on that location?
First of all, I want to talk about the origins of the information that I am conveying. We talk about this book, Creating Capitol Hill, and almost everything that I'm talking about is from that book. And I didn't write it. I didn't do the research on it. I'm just reading it and giving you the products of the research and then adding a little bit. Most of what I tell you comes from Pam Scott, one of the premier researchers in Washington here about Washington history. The maps, I credit Don Hawkins with them when I show them, but he has put prodigious research into this. He's the premier person of mapping historic Washington. Don Kennan was the editor of the book and really carried it through to completion. And finally, Charles Carroll Carter, who I guess we would call the torchbearer. The book came out of a conversation that Carroll and I had 20 years ago about the Carroll family and the fact that they don't get credit for their role in creating Washington, D.C. And after a lot of years of discussion and talking about how we could deal with it, and Carroll raised the money that got us started on this book and bringing it to completion. So those are the people that have done all the research and carried through, and I'm just here having fun with it now. First of all, we always start with the L'Enfant map, and I'm pointing out what are actually 3 blocks here with the yellow arrow, or the orange arrows around them. And then the blue cross is the intersection that I'm talking about. But as Lauren said, I found so much information that I'm not going to get to cover more than just the northeast part of this, of what I've indicated here on the map. This is the Don Hawkins 1801 map. You can see where the Capitol is, and then that sort of angular road across to the right of it and below, and it ends at the block that we're talking about. This is the current footprint of the Library of Congress, and so it shows you how much of this area is taken up with the 3 buildings of the library. Now, this is the Latrobe map from after the British burned the neighborhood, or parts of it, and this shows you again the section that we're talking about. Here is the current map, and shows the Library of Congress Jefferson Building, and that's the area we're going to be dealing with primarily today. To the right of that is the Adams Building. That's always a little confusing to me, because when I came to Washington, that was called the Jefferson Annex to the Library of Congress, and there wasn't a name for the main building. But then they built the Madison Building, and they decided they all needed names, and they wanted to put Jefferson first. So now what I knew as the Jefferson Annex is called the Adams Building. Now here it is in satellite, and you can see the 3 buildings over there on the right. Now back to the Don Hawkins map, and this is pointing to the building that was on the location where the library is now. That's what we're going to be talking about primarily right now. Here is the Latrobe map of that square. I've blown it up so you can see and have a sense of it. What is on the left there is the main building itself, and then it has that extension across the back and another building behind, and that probably was the stables and the area where on the second floor where the servants, the enslaved and free African Americans would have lived, as well as in the garret, which we'll see in a moment. Now this is a picture of the building. We can tell that this photograph was taken after 1855 because that's when the streets were leveled, and the building turned out to be about 10 feet above the street level, and so they had to add all those staircases across the front there. But you can get a picture of it here. You can see the dormers in the top, which indicate garrets up there, and that was where enslaved people would have lived, and the other servants. And then in the back on the left, right at the margin, you can see that there's what's probably a 2-story building back there. That would have been the stables and place for the enslaved people and the servants to live back there. Now, to really understand this situation, I think we have to look at this wonderful painting from George Cook and W.J. Bennett in 1824. The blue arrow is where Carroll Row is. It's in front of the Capitol there. The orange arrow right near it is pointing at Duddington's mansion. And that kind of gives you some scale of what you're looking at. The yellow arrow is the White House. And then the green arrow off to the left is pointing toward Alexandria. And I show you those 2 things because we know that Congressman Manasseh Cutler lived in Carroll Row in 1801 when the Congress was first meeting in Washington, and he had the room on the corner at the end on the right from the photograph, which I'll show you in a moment. And he could see both the White House and Alexandria. Now, this painting is done 20 years later, and so there's much, much more here, but still you get a sense of how much he must have been able to see just from his room in Carroll Row. Now, as I was walking around taking pictures for this, I discovered, as I was looking, the building on the right here, you can just see the edge of, is the Adams building of the library. And on the left is the Folger Shakespeare Library. You can tell from the dumpster that I'm photographing through the alley there. But there we have two of the remaining boarding houses that still exist here on Capitol Hill. They are on 3rd Street Southeast, right behind the Library of Congress and the Folger Shakespeare Library. Here's a better shot of them. These are definitely very early 18th century or 19th century buildings. And probably the fake shutters are new. I think I remember when they went up. But these buildings still exist and you can still rent rooms in them. My understanding is that this is the most common place for the actors at the Shakespeare Theater, the Folger Shakespeare Theater, I should say, to stay while they're acting in the Capitol. But these buildings are clearly ones that originated in that era and that were used for boarding houses. Here's another one. This was on 2nd Street Northeast, just behind the Supreme Court. And it's the center building there. You can compare it with the one to the right, which has nice fancy windows and everything, and know that the one on the right is going to be later. My guess is that the cornice at the top of this one was added later as well, that they wouldn't have built a building with an Italian cornice like that in that era, but so they've probably added that to kind of fancy up the building. But you can tell it's a pretty plain building, and it doesn't stick out in front of its front door. And that's important to understand on Capitol Hill because the property lines on Capitol Hill all run with the front door. That is, they built the buildings right on the property line, and your front steps always stick out into city property. That brick building to the left is a house, and that porch, front porch there, will have actually belongs on city land. The deed of that property will have a codicil on it, indicating that the city can actually come along and take off your front porch if they want to. That you are getting out on city property with their indulgence, but they still own it. And they own all of the front yards on Capitol Hill generally. So when a building is right on the boundary, you can usually tell that that's older because it was only in the 1870s that they began to allow the property builders to extend out onto city property. And usually it's a bay window or a porch like that one. Here's a closer view of that building that is identified as an early 19th century boarding house. So we still have some of these boarding houses left on Capitol Hill. But let's go back here. Again, you can see here that the architecture is pretty plain. But in 1795, Daniel Carroll of Duddington notified the city that he was going to begin construction on a major project. He had to pay for his own property survey because the city still was not fully surveyed, and you had to get in line, and the only way to keep from getting in line was to pay for it separately yourself. And so he had to pay to get his property surveyed. And in October of 1800, he announced the opening of 5 three-story brick houses. And the name Carroll Row was actually carved into the stone on the corner on the right. And that top window in the corner there is the one that Manasseh Cutler was writing about, where he could see Alexandria and the White House from that window. That reminds me of myself, because when I was at American University, I lived in Letts Hall, and there was only one room in Letts Hall on the top floor, the 9th floor, from which you could see the Capitol Dome and the Washington Monument and the cathedral. And so when I was a sophomore, I got that room, so I got to have that one room where you could see all over the city. And that reminded me of when I was reading about Congressman Cutler writing to his daughter about the fact that he could see all over the city. Now, looking on the left, you can see there's a 7-bay building there, and it's got fancier windows than the others. That was built to be a hotel, and when you put a Palladian window on a as is in the center there above the door, that window with an arched fan light above the center is called a Palladian window. You can see there's kind of a stylized one above it. That is an indication that this is a public building. Not that it's owned by the public, but that it's going to be commercial in nature, or at least governmental. And so that's a little indication of fanciness that you don't see across the rest of the front. Then the second building is 4 bays, and you can see it's got some kind of an unusual opening to the left of the regular door there. That probably was some kind of a public entrance. But the other 3 each have 3 bays, and they were intended to be boarding houses. We don't have any records of the interiors except people commenting on the fact that they were unusually fancy for buildings on Capitol Hill. It is thought that James Hoban actually designed this for Daniel Carroll, although there's record of it. There's no record, but we know that Hoban bought one of the pieces of property behind it, and that Carroll sold him another piece of land, probably at a discount price, in exchange for having designed these buildings. But this was to be Duddington's big moment. The rooms were reported to be large and airy for buildings that were going up in Washington at that time. So he's being very pretentious about it. By the way, I got a magnifying glass out and looked at the sign that's on that second building on the left there, and it says Columbia or Capital Business College on it. So it was being used for a commercial purpose as well, and that may be what that commercial entrance was there, whereas the center entrance, the one right above the staircase there, probably was to get to the rooms upstairs. The architect sign, which you can see clearly, we don't know what architect would have occupied that room. We do know that Robert Mills, the architect, lived in the neighborhood, but he lived down on New Jersey Avenue, where his wife kept a boarding house for members of Congress, so we don't think that is Robert Mills. And I want to talk about some of the proprietors that we know about, some of the boarding house keepers here. The first one is Josiah King. And King moved with the government from Philadelphia, where he'd been working for the Congress. He was the engrossing clerk of the House of Representatives. That's engrossing is when you create the final fancy copy of the bill before it passes. Josiah King's wife's brother was a congressman from South Carolina, and was later a senator from Maryland. His name was Harper. He was married to a daughter of Charles Carroll of Carrollton. Now, this is Duddington's uncle and the dominant member of the Carroll family. Charles Carroll of Carrollton is the one who signed the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. His statue is in the collection in the crypt of the Capitol, and he's founder of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. So he's the dominant figure, and it's sort of he that Duddington aspires to be. So this congressman is married to Duddington's second cousin, so this is the family connection that probably got King involved in Duddington's grand moment. King and his wife kept a boarding house there on the corner, and they were the hosts for Congressman Manasseh Cutler that I quoted earlier. The same letter to his daughter talks about what a nice person Mrs. King was, and that the King's daughter played the piano in the parlor in the evenings to entertain the boarders, and she sang and had a nice voice. King himself shortly became a clerk in the State Department and kept boarding houses over there. He did not stay with this, so probably like the other proprietors, he didn't make much money at it. But he has one more great moment, and that is that he was the clerk in the State Department in 1814, and he is the man who saved the Declaration of Independence from the fires that the British were setting. So he took all of the treaties and the State Department papers. The State Department had the function that the National Archive has now of keeping the state papers. And so he is the one who saved the Declaration of Independence that day while the British were burning the city. The second boarding house keeper is Benjamin Birch, B-U-R-C-H. He was known as Captain because he was a captain in the Revolutionary War, and he owned one of the houses for renting by 1801. And then for 28 years, from 1801 to 1825, he was the assistant doorkeeper of the house. He was also an alderman in the city of Washington and a city council member. He spent several years moving from house to house among Duddington's various properties here on Capitol Hill. He starts in 1801. By 1804, he's owing Duddington back rent. Duddington even had the sheriff come and assess the value of his furniture and goods in case he wanted to claim them. Again, in 1810, there's a sheriff's sale of the contents of a grocery store that Birch had tried to start. But still, in December of 1813, he's still keeping boarding houses for Carroll on B Street, which is to the right here. Along there somewhere, he's keeping a boarding house in another square. He has a tavern that was burned by the British in 1814. I'm sorry, on the square where Carroll had a tavern that we talked about the other day that was burned by the British, Birch was keeping a boarding house for Carroll on that square. That's the square that was taken for the extension of the Capitol grounds, so it doesn't exist anymore. Jane, are you?
We've got a couple questions
Okay.
from your fans. There was a story, somebody said that Abraham Lincoln lived on Carroll Row when he was in the House of Representatives. Is that the case?
Yes, I will get to that.
Okay, we'll get there. And what is the date of the photograph that we're looking at now?
We don't know. What we do know is it's probably taken from the Capitol Dome. It's attributed to Matthew Brady, but we don't know for sure. But probably about sometime after 1863, 1865.
And the other question is, people were asking about the street level is so low. Did they have English basements that were used for storage business, or what's the story about the low level?
Oh, well, the Capitol itself is not at the top of Capitol Hill. The land sloped upward from the Capitol building, and so the street is leveled down to the front of the Capitol building, and so that's why these appear to be so high. Yes, there definitely was a basement. If you look at the end on the left there, you can see that there's pretty clearly another story below ground level there, but Carroll chose to put his buildings up high on the hill so that they could look down on the Capitol. But you pay a price for that, and when they leveled the streets, his buildings are stuck up there. Same thing that happened with George Washington's houses.
Exactly. I've heard that story. Now, somebody said, remind us who saved the Declaration.
Okay, his name is Josias King.
Okay.
Sister-in-law is married to a congressman and so forth.
How to win at trivia.
So he's the one that's actually related to the Carrolls.
Okie doke.
Yes.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Okay, I'm still in the story of Benjamin Birch. I hadn't gotten to the end of him. So he's still keeping boarding houses on properties that Daniel Carroll owns, even though Carroll has been trying to collect the rent from him. That's 1813. Now his building did not get burned by the British, but it was on the same block as Carroll's Tavern that did. By 1822, Birch is on East Capitol Street, and all these years he's been making payments to Carroll against the rents that he owes him from the past, but never managed to get out of debt that we know of. By 1824, Birch's son was a clerk in the House of Representatives, and it's his son who published the first compilation of DC law. So the family continues and establishes itself. So he's one of the tavern keeper or boarding house keepers in Carroll Row. The third one we actually have a drawing of. This is Pontius Stell, and he's quite well known on Capitol Hill. His was a Huguenot family like Greenleaf's, but he's several generations in America. His father had kept a boarding house in Trenton for the New Jersey legislature, and Stell's wife was a hostess for the governor at the mansion in New Jersey because her sister was the governor's wife. So they're going to move to Washington with the government and set up a boarding house here. And first they did in Thomas Law's properties down New Jersey Avenue. And indeed, he even rented Thomas Law's second house, the fancy one with the ballroom that we talked about earlier, in 1802 for that session of Congress. Later in 1804, he purchases George Walker's first hotel that we talked about. This is the one on the site of the Supreme Court now that was the first hotel in the neighborhood. But he couldn't pay the rent by 1810 and managed to sell that. Between 1804 and 1809, he operated the hotel on Carroll Row. We don't know for sure whether it was the 7-bay building or the 4-bay building, but it was well known. It was called Stell's Hotel. And there are several letters from Carroll's relative writing letters to Duddington recounting their attempts to collect the rent from Stell at these various properties. But Stell always pointed out that he wasn't making any money on the boarding houses, and so he couldn't pay. By 1811, there's a sheriff's sale of Stell's household goods and so forth. And he becomes a clerk in the Treasury Department, which of course is up by the White House. And he tried to keep a boarding house near the Treasury as well, but that only went on for a couple of years. But they established themselves enough that Stell's great-granddaughter compiled his history in the early 20th century. She's a well-known historian in the area. So this family stayed around, but he had the same problems that all of the others did. Now here we are back to the photograph again. Another boarding house keeper is Samuel Smith. Smith was a congressman from Pennsylvania for 3 terms, but when he lost the election, he decided to stick around Washington to try to get a government job. He did, but while he was waiting, he kept a boarding house in one of Carroll's properties here. But within a year, there's another sheriff's sale that's listed in the newspaper, and Congressman Smith was able to get a federal appointment in Alabama, which was the frontier at that point. But everything he did out there failed, and he died sort of ignominiously later. So he's another one that didn't make it through this. A fifth one is Christina Hamilton. She was keeping boarding houses in George Washington's houses when they were burned. Her son was the clerk in the house, and he's the one that we think probably stowed the papers in the basement there that the British found that caused them to burn the house. But later on, in 1822, she advertises for 6 to 8 members of Congress to stay at her boarding house in Carroll Row. One of the most interesting people is Dr. James Ewell, E-W-E-L-L, and he had the end house that Josiah King had had. He had a medical practice there with his brother Thomas Ewell, and on August the 24th, 1814, when the British came to town, he remembered and wrote one of the most prominent accounts of the British coming. General Ross had planned to use that end house as his headquarters, but Ewell stopped and chatted with Ross a little bit. And Ross said, well, he'd been intending to take that house, but he wouldn't, and he would let the Ewell family have it undisturbed. But Ewell insisted that Ross use the house, and he and his family moved next door into Mrs. McCardle's boarding house and let General Ross stay in that house. He did that in hopes of getting the general not to burn as many of his neighbors' properties. And so he bargained with Ross. They were very friendly, and in fact, Ross stopped them from looting Ewell's house, the end one, and let Ewell apparently convince him not to burn the bank, which was on New Jersey Avenue a couple of blocks away, by pointing out that it was a private bank and not a public property. So Ewell claims credit, at least, for saving that and some other properties in the city by letting Ross use his house to stay that night. Now, I mentioned Mrs. McCardle, and we find her again by 1834. So she was apparently there, had one of these houses, probably one of the two in the middle there, between 1814 and 1834. We know because she was owning the property when Carroll was finally forced to sell it. And they advertised the property as being the land underneath Mrs. McCardle's boarding house. So we think that she kept that throughout the whole period, but Carroll was not paying his taxes, as we'll get to. But she is still there. So it was advertised just the land for sale, and the house would still be operated by Ms. McCardle. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself again. I've got another proprietor here, Nicholas Queen. He had the hotel on the left by 1820, and it was called Queen's Hotel. In 1824, it was the site of a banquet. This was the farewell banquet for Thomas Law. Law has decided to retire at that point and go out to his new property in Oxon Hill. But his friends and business partners had decided to put on a big banquet for him. And supposedly 60 guests were in there and the Marine Band. They advertised in the newspaper this dinner, and Law lived out in Oxon Hill ever after that. He still had properties here in Washington, but generally he wasn't involved. He had property managers who took care of that. To contrast, he's got 60 guests at his farewell dinner here in Queen's Hotel. Thomas Law himself threw a housewarming party out in Oxon Hill for his new property, and 900 guests showed up. He was still a very popular guy. By 1818, Carroll is appealing the tax assessment against this property. He says, I'm not making any money on it. You're taxing it way too high, trying to get it to be reduced. The Panic of 1819 is when Carroll's empire really collapsed. He was the president of the Bank of Washington, the one that Dr. Ewell saved from being burned, and the oldest bank in the city of Washington. And he resigned from the bank at that point because of the panic. By 1822, he began systematically suing his tenants at his various properties to try to get them to pay their back rent so that he could pay his back taxes. By 1825, he begins offering to sell Carroll Row in the newspaper. But part of the problem with Mr. Carroll was that he would not drop his prices. He wanted the full value for them, so nobody would buy them. By 1834, the sheriff began to offer Carroll's properties for back taxes to the highest bidder, and they had listed 483 lots of Carroll's property on sale, including all of Carroll Row. Now, the one last boarding house keeper that we know the building continued, but Carroll probably did not own it. But Mrs. Spriggs, who kept a boarding house in 1847, was the hostess to Abraham Lincoln and Mary Lincoln. Mary came with Abe for the first session of the Congress, but the second session, Abe was here by himself in 1848. So that's where I'm going to stop. But the story of the property goes on in the 1870s and 1880s, but it's not in the book. And so probably lots and lots more stories about this property. Why don't we stop for some questions, Jane?
Oh, good. I was just going to say, we've got a couple questions here. One is about the building itself. And the question is, it looks like there's some kind of wing in the back with the 4 large chimneys. Do you have any idea what that is about?
Yes, we can, let me go back to Latrobe's map here. See, here it is. It's right there in the middle of the block there, and it's attached. What you're seeing is I'm sorry, I was talking about the back, the stables, but you can see it's attached, and that apparently was that wing that you can see. But it may be an addition that was put onto that hotel. I can't tell exactly. Yes, that actually looks like it's not on that Latrobe map, so it must have been added with the chimneys there. Probably they're adding rooms for more accommodation, and each room would have a fireplace in it. So thanks for pointing that out. I hadn't noticed the fact that's not on the Latrobe map.
Well, let me ask you another couple questions. Were there any churches in the area?
Yes, there were lots. Most famously, of course, they were holding church services in the Capitol itself. The House chamber was used. But Daniel Carroll made sure there were Catholic churches around. The Episcopalians put a major church, which still exists, Christ Church, out on G Street. Yeah, it's on G. The Presbyterians, in particular, the Presbyterians built on South Capitol Street, right across from the Capitol grounds, and they didn't stay there long. But it was purchased by African Americans, and they had a church there for a long time. And I'll talk about that one later. But that church is famous as the location at which more African American men signed up for the Army when they began accepting African Americans than anywhere else in America. More people at that church across from the Capitol signed up. So that is also in the book. Anybody that wants to can read ahead on that and find out about that church. But there are churches all over Capitol Hill. And
do you have any perspective on, why was it so difficult for the small businesses to survive during this time when, Congress was there was a built-in market, but there was something else going on?
Congress was not here. Congress was here for only 2 to 3 months out of the year.
Okay.
That is the problem. Think of this as this 18th century equivalent of a beach community. If you can imagine having a beach, say, in Nova Scotia, and it's only warm enough not to freeze your toes off for a couple of months out of the year, then you have the equivalent of what was going on in Washington. The problem is that they put a lot of money into the construction of these buildings, and Carroll was very careful about charging rent that was a percentage of the original cost of the building. So that's the reason why he's not discounting the prices to try to get the properties to move, is because he's carefully recovering his costs. And so that is the reason why it was so difficult, is they could only rent out for maybe 3 months out of the year.
Got it. And who ran the boarding house where the Lincolns lived?
Mrs. Spriggs is her name. I have not learned anything more about her than that.
Well, she certainly had a famous tenant.
Although, there may be in other books, but not in this one.
And, while you're talking about the book, we do want to thank all those of you who purchased the book from the Society, and you're welcome at any time to go on the website, and you can get the book both in hard and soft cover. It's a fascinating story, and then you'll have all these stories to look at as we move forward. So I think we've got this building pretty much understood.
Yeah, I've got a little bit more material about those other 2 small blocks.
Oh, good.
I'll take the time now.
Yep, let's do that.
Okay. Now, this is kind of fuzzy because of because I'm blowing it up from Latrobe's map. But you can see there are 2 triangular shaped squares to the south of this. And actually, I just realized that maybe, no. Anyway, they were called Square 730 and 731. They actually formed a square by themselves. But this is the location where Thomas Law had wanted George Washington to build his houses. It's right on Pennsylvania Avenue, goes through the middle of the block there. And this was to be the developed commercial center on the hill. Daniel Carroll ended up building a lot of small buildings there. And George Washington didn't want to be in a commercial area. He wanted his house to be isolated, and he liked the idea of looking down on the Capitol building. So that's why he chose up on North Capitol Street instead of down here. But that ended up making his houses isolated and difficult to get to, and nobody ever made any money on those buildings either. Now, I wanted to show you the one photograph I have that shows you anything about these blocks there. Okay. Now, this is the end of that previous photograph that we've looked at. You can see the end of Carroll Row here. But I put that green arrow on what looks like a cemetery. Well, it's not. It is a marble dealer. This guy made cemetery markers and sold marble there. And it ends up in this photograph. So this is an indication this is a commercial area. And the difference between this and most of what we've been talking about, these fancy houses. So it's a marble and tombstone building. This one, I can show you a little bit more about the neighborhood and sort of what has disappeared. You can see the green arrow that shows where A Street ends now and at the Adams building. And it is along 2nd Street there that these, or 3rd Street there, where those boarding houses are that I showed. Way over on the left, the yellow arrow shows you where A Street went originally. It went that far right onto the Capitol grounds by a block. But when the Library of Congress was built, they blocked off A Street. So then when they wanted to build an annex to the Library of Congress, they blocked off another block of A Street. But if you can see above the Adams building, there is an alley between there and the Folger Library. And that's the one where I took that shot showing you where the boarding houses are. The blue arrow down below the Adams building shows you that Pennsylvania Avenue has even been chopped off by a block. They took the block away. And so it is where the words Library of Congress Jefferson Building are that this block, these 2 blocks of commercial properties ended up. Daniel Carroll developed much of it and again had trouble collecting the rents from the property owners. They weren't making much money. So that is where those 2 blocks disappeared that were taken over for the Library of Congress. So no particular property of distinction there. back on the Latrobe map, you can see there's only a few brick buildings. Again, he drew only the brick buildings that were permanent and left off any wooden buildings, so we don't know exactly how many buildings were there. This is 1815 when Latrobe is drawing this. Okay, I think that takes care of today. I got lots more material, but we can hold that for another session.
Well, Steve, I tell you, this is absolutely fascinating. If you can see the window into history, we are so grateful for your contributions. Let me just ask one final question as we close out this session. Those of us who live today, whenever there's private property taken for public building, it's quite a controversial drama. Was there any conversation before the Library of Congress took the private property about whose view was going to be blocked and what was going to happen?
Well, the properties wouldn't have been that prominent by the time they took them, but there is a story about the Adams building. The Congress began to buy up properties back there with the intention of doing that. And so after the Adams building was done, they began to acquire properties in the next block. And there is still a parking lot. I believe it's for the Supreme Court along A Street. That must be northeast. But the part of the origin of the Capitol Hill Restoration Society, which is the organization of property owners on Capitol Hill, the origin of that was to get the Congress to stop eating away at our neighborhood. And after many years of protests and negotiation and so forth, finally in the, it would have been the 1970s, the architect of the Capitol agreed and wrote a development plan for the Capitol grounds, and has declared a policy that they will not go east of 3rd Street or even 2nd Street in Northeast. That they're going to stop buying up properties out there. And in fact, they have even divested some properties that they had taken in the past. So yes, there was controversy, and finally now we have drawn a line, and supposedly the Capitol will not take anything more to the east. So they're moving north and south, and we can talk about some of that in future sessions.
Well, thank you. Thank you again, Steve. Thank you to our participants and our listeners. We hope that you all have a wonderful celebration of the 4th of July. Remember what the country stands for, and that is the work that we do at the Capitol Historical Society to talk about what it really means to honor our founding documents and the continuing effort to make our country stronger, more full participants. And we are grateful that you're all participating. Thank you for your support. Don't forget to buy merchandise, buy the books. You can buy jewelry. You can buy lovely plasticware for your picnics. Ties, and Steve models a different tie every time he does this. So, for those of you who have to wear ties during Zoom, we know you're in your shorts on the bottom, but you can look really stylish in the top. Thank you very much. Be well.